Thank you everybody for joining us today. I'm really excited to be able to talk about loyal forces. Lindsay Barnes and I co-authored this book that was published in 2013. And we did it after an exhibition about the larger topic of animals in war that we had at the museum. And then for the book, we actually decided to narrow the focus a little bit just to talk about the US military and their use of animals throughout the war. So I'm going to talk about 4 main animals today, and then if we have some time, I'll try to get in a couple other fun topics as well. But we're going to talk about mules, dogs, pigeons, and horses. So we'll go to the first slide here on mules. And so, although they're often looked down upon because of their stubborn and abject natures, the phrase tough as a government mule is probably one that a lot of us are familiar with. They are indeed very hardworking and widely used in the military, both before World War II and during the war. And they really did prove vital in some areas. But why use mules? Well, mules have a really sturdy nature and they're very sure-footed, and they were really vital on some of the rugged terrains that were impassable by military vehicles. They require less grain than horses and are a much more dependable work animal. They so are actually quite intelligent, which is sort of quite contrary to popular belief. And it's actually their intelligence that helps them recognize their own limits of strength and endurance. So this quality that is sometimes read as stubbornness is really a form of self-preservation. So unlike horses, mules will not work themselves to death. So we'll go to the next slide. So during World War I, the Army used mules by the hundreds of thousands and kept nearly 80,000 after World War I during that interwar period. But as the US military became more mechanized and was relying more and more on wheeled and tracked vehicles along with aircraft, the use of mules declined. But as the troops were working through the terrains of North Africa and Italy, and even more so in the CBI, or the China, Burma, India theater, mules will prove really vital. And the Army would actually procure local mules in Italy and then eventually buy 14,000 more during the war. According to a manual about mules in the military, this is what it says about a good mule. It says, a pack mule should be 14 3/4 hands to 15 1/2 hands in height and weigh from 1,000 to 1,200 pounds. He should be compact, stockily built, and have a short neck, short, straight, and well-muscled back and loins, low withers and croup, large barrel with deep girth, straight, strong legs, and short pasterns and good feet. Okay, if that wasn't enough, mules were also picked based on their personality. They needed to have composure, quietness, a calmness. These traits were also really important when you would have hundreds of mules all moving together through really narrow pathways and often in really intimidating jungles. So similarly, the US military selected mule skinners based on their knowledge of animals and their lack of fear of large animals. Mule handlers were expected to be patient, to be kind and firm. They were instructed to train the mules with positive reinforcement, reward the mule with petting and hand feeding when it acted the way that they wanted it to, and strictly prohibited things like sticks, switches, or other items that might instill fear in the mule. All the mules were trained to be ridden, to be led, to stand quietly, to walk, to stand fully packed, move in a herd, swim, and finally, they also had to be immersed in the sounds of battle. Battle inoculation was really key to making sure that the mules didn't panic when they encountered some of these loud noises. So they would be worked in and around motor parks, which would allow them to become familiar with the smell of gasoline and the sound of engines. They were led among low-flying aircraft and near gunfire. And this conditioning, the animals learned that the noises around them would not hurt them. And as a result, when they did encounter them, they remained calm. In all units, the most well-trained mule was deemed the bell mare and the lead pack mule. She wore a special bell around her neck and to alert all the other mules to her presence. And all the mules were trained to follow the bell mare through any kind of condition. So if she swam the river, the other mules swam the river. If she climbed the hill, they climbed the hill. And they actually used this pack saddle that you see here in this photograph. This is the U.S. Army Phillips cargo pack saddle, and it was for use for all kinds of pack loads, those that carried artillery, those that carried equipment, even the ones that actually were the heaviest weapons cargo loads as well. By itself, it weighs 72 pounds. And then when you would add sometimes all of the attachments that it would take for the different types of loads, it could weigh 95 pounds alone. It could hold up to 300 pounds of cargo though. So 300 mules carrying 300 pounds each meant that one pack unit could carry 45 tons, which is a lot of materials. So during World War II, mules worked around the world, both for Allied and Axis armies, and they served in units in Africa and higher numbers in Italy, but really formed the decisive backbone in the China, Burma, India theater. And this theater was one of the most geographically challenging environments in which soldiers saw combat during World War II. It was a place where mules proved themselves even more versatile than a Jeep. So the most famous pack unit in the CBI was the Mars Task Force, and they were a really successful and self-sufficient military unit. Self-sufficient because of the cargo loads that they supported in operations with the 6th, 12th, and 6th, 13th Field Artillery Battalions. They had a traveling medical, quartermaster, and veterinary units all within the pack mule train. And it was really the ultimate proof of the animal's importance in a mechanized army, because the mobility of the mules in really rough terrain was actually more important than speed. And you can see, if you follow that white line in the photograph, you can see how long this mule train is here in the jungle. So the Mars Task Force was the second of 2 American long-range penetration units that employed mules and fought behind Japanese lines in the jungles of Burma, which is today's Myanmar. Its job was to function behind these lines deep in the jungles of the mountains of Southwest Asia and to protect and keep China's supply route going. The US really wanted to continue to keep the Japanese forces occupied in China as much as they possibly could. So from any vantage, this terrain was really intimidating, and it was impossible for most motorized vehicles to cross. So these strong, sure-footed mules were needed to carry artillery on the mountain trails, sometimes in single file, like you saw in the previous picture. So the only way that these men could operate behind enemy lines was that they received supplies by airdrop. So you can see some parachutes falling here. And except for these planes, these were the only mechanized transportation that was available. So these mules were the force's only reliable means of movement and supplies. And sorry, can you go back one? No, you're right. Sorry, stay where you are. Okay, so one of the mule skinners whose material that you have in our collection is Hiram Boone. And Boone was born in 1921 in Marion, Virginia, and he went to work in a gunpowder factory when he graduated high school. But then at the age of 22, he decided to join the Army. So he was inducted in the Army on September 23rd, 1943. And he was first sent to Fort Sill, Oklahoma for basic training, and also there for artillery training. And he worked specifically with the 75mm pack howitzer and mules. He moved on to Camp Gruber, Oklahoma, where he joined the 612th Field Artillery Battalion and was assigned to their headquarters and service battery. Here again, he did further training with the 75mm pack howitzer and mules. And then the 612th moved on to train in Camp Carson, Colorado to prepare for the mountains of Burma. They didn't know where they were headed at the time, but they knew that they were going to be fighting in mountain conditions. So they also trained really specifically in the rapid unpacking and of the artillery and then piecing it together for combat. And in an oral history that we have with Boone, he says that a gun could be unloaded in a matter of minutes and be in a firing position. So they trained really hard to get that down. So the 612th would actually reach Calcutta in September of 1944. Believe it or not, they would get on a boat, come down the Mississippi River, through the port of New Orleans, the Gulf of Mexico, go to the Atlantic coast. all on a boat, all with their mules with them. And from there, from that Atlantic port till they got to India, 63 days across the Atlantic, through the Mediterranean, Suez Canal, the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean before they arrived in India. So they spent a long time with these animals on this boat. So Boone's job in the field was to collect ammunition and food and other supplies from these airdrops that I've already described. He had to be in a certain location on a given date to reach the dropped goods before the Japanese found them. And all those supplies were then loaded onto the pack mules to be carried out of the drop zone. So artillery, ammunition, including those 75 millimeter artillery rounds, and rations were dropped by parachute. And then the mule feed itself was actually just free dropped, just no parachute at all. And it was packed loosely enough that it wouldn't burst on impact. But all of these materials came from the United States, including the mule feed, and were airdropped typically from C-47s. So Boone's personal riding mount was his mule Chick, and you can see pictures here of Boone and Chick. And he traveled with him really from the beginning of his journey all the way to China. He was actually, they were assigned together at Camp Landis, and Boone cared for him and groomed him every day in addition to all of his other duties. And he said of the mules, of the Mars mules in his oral history, they're smart, much smarter than horses. They will not overdrink, they will not overeat, they will not overwork. They are superior in footage and rough terrain to a horse, and they're actually smarter than a horse. He did hold these animals in very good regard. At the end of the war, the mules were slated to be handed over to the Chinese military, but unfortunately, many of them had contracted a fatal disease called Sura, and they had to be put down. And so Boone said at the end of his oral history, he ended it with this thought: I did want to praise this mule, and I frankly think that mules and other animals did not receive and have not received the recognition they are entitled to, because they all did pay the supreme sacrifice. So we also have some of the pictures that you saw in this presentation are actually ones that Hiram Boone himself took and donated to the museum. So it was really amazing to me when I started to do the research for the exhibition and ultimately for the book that I learned about the US not having a war dog program until World War II. We think of dogs today as a really basic tool of military and police work. That, you know, we hardly question their ability to smell bombs or drugs or that prosciutto that you weren't supposed to be bringing back from Europe. But at the start of the war, the US only had sled and pack dogs working in the military. Now, other countries in Europe had been using dogs pretty successfully in World War I by the French and the Belgians, Germans as messengers, medics, and pack animals. But there was some really forward-thinking military men and enthusiastic dog fanciers, and really felt that the US military should undertake a war dog training program. And so they really were able to foresee some of the ways that dogs could be useful in both combat and non-combat situations. So one of the first things that they had to do was recruit dogs. So in 1942, Dogs for Defense was formed, and believe it or not, everyday people would volunteer their own dogs for service. And if those dogs cleared the health checks and the intelligence tests, they were sent on to be trained as war dogs. And you can see here, you could support the War Dog Fund financially as well as volunteering your dog. So we have a couple of dog tags for the War Dog Fund, as well as some certificates for Boogie and Stinky, who also donated to the War Dog program. There were 4 main types of war dogs needed for the war effort: scout and sentry dogs, messenger dogs, attack dogs, and then roving or scout dogs. There was also a 5th type, a mine detection dogs. And today we think of this as, again, a really basic element of what working dogs do. But at the outset of the program, no one realized that they could train the dogs to smell for the explosives. Rather, they were trained to look for disturbances on the ground. And unfortunately, this method did not work very well, and the M-Dog, Mine Dog program was deemed a failure. Attack dogs, similarly, were also a victim to a bad training program. They did not use positive reinforcement. They were actually trained with really negative methods. And they didn't also turn out to be a good success as the military had hoped. And they were sometimes used as a supplement to a guard dogs, or if there was anyone who was a threat to a guarded facility. But the real heart of the dog training program was in sentry dogs, and all dogs were trained to be sentries, but some dogs would go on to get more extensive training in other areas. Though their overall training was less intense than other working dogs, they still needed to be moderately intelligent, willing, and somewhat aggressive. Sentry dogs were trained to accompany both military and civilian patrols in various conditions and to give a warning through barking or growling at the approach of another person. And then probably something that many of us are familiar with is the use of dogs as messengers. So messenger dogs could carry a message 4 to 5 times faster than the average soldier on foot. And dogs have a much lower profile than humans, making them harder to locate and more challenging to shoot. And the equipment that the dog needed was minimal, only a small canister around the neck, or, and what you see in this photograph, a pouch sort of tied around the body of the dog. They were the only dogs that were trained with 2 handlers. This way, the dog would know who to seek out to deliver the message. One of the most famous war dogs was the messenger dog Kiser. He was a German shepherd who served during the Bougainville campaign. Kiser was with M Company of the 3rd Marine Raider Battalion, and their job was to hold a roadblock on the Piva Trail. Because of the dense foliage, radios were unable to send or receive signals, and Kiser provided a vital communications link, and he completed 11 messenger missions. Kiser was not only an accomplished messenger dog, but also valuable as a sentry dog. 3 days into the Bougainville campaign, Kiser rushed out of the foxhole he shared with one of his handlers, Private First Class John Mayo. Mayo called the dog back, and as he was returning, a Japanese sniper shot Kiser. A firefight ensued, but Kiser had disappeared. So he was later found with his other handler, Private First Class John Kleeman, and the bullet hit too close to his heart to operate, but despite his wounds, Kiser survived and actually returned to duty 3 weeks later. And although injured and scared, his loyalty to his handlers saved him and warned others of how close the Japanese soldiers were. But it is really the scout or roving patrol dogs that really changed the way the military and servicemen thought about dogs in the military. These dogs were some of the most highly trained in the military, used primarily in the Pacific. They would walk up to 25 yards in front of a column of Marines or soldiers. And when the dog sensed an enemy soldier, it would give a signal or an alert to its handler. And this signal or alert was really key because it had to be silent. And so handlers and dogs were actually paired together during basic training for them both. And they spent their whole military lives together essentially because the dog and the handler had to know each other very well and have a lot of trust in one another. And so there are a lot of stories about dog men being made fun of by other Marines and soldiers. But you get one instance like I described with Kiser, or like I'll describe with Kurt, and they often did earn very much the respect of those that were around him. So you can see some Doberman pinschers here, often used by the Marine Corps in the Pacific. So by having the dogs go out ahead of the column, they would then be able to sense that enemy presence before the main body of the soldiers or the Marines would walk through. So Kurt was a Doberman pinscher whose bravery similarly saved the lives of 250 Marines on the island of Guam. He alerted to Japanese soldiers laying in wait on a jungle hillside above Asan Point. And his handler was Private First Class Alan Jacobson. And they killed 2 Japanese soldiers before a mortar shell exploded near them. And those Japanese soldiers were part of a much larger force. And Kurt's discovery of the outpost kept the 21st Marine Regiment from stumbling directly into the main body. Unfortunately, this mortar shell tore a large chunk out of Kurt's back, and with his spine exposed and surgery impossible, he suffered for most of the day before he succumbed to his wounds. But his sacrifice led to his likeness being cast in a bronze to memorialize all the dogs who gave their lives for the liberation of Guam. And you can see this monument that stands there with the names of many of the other dogs who gave their lives for that liberation. So Dogs for Defense obtained 18,000 dogs during the 3 years it was in charge of procurement for the Quartermaster Corps. In all, over 10,000 dogs were trained for war, and nearly 3,000 dogs were sent overseas. Dogs proved to be an invaluable resource in the Pacific and on the home front. And when the dogs were recruited, owners were promised that if their dogs survived the war, they would be returned to them. And that promise proved difficult to fulfill. The US military did not anticipate the thousands of hours of retraining and demilitarization training that would cost to fulfill such a promise. But through the work of Lieutenant William Putney and Major Harold Gores, the dogs were given that demilitarization training and sent home. So homing pigeons, believe it or not, we still used pigeons in World War II. One of the oldest means of long distance communication were widely used. They are a specific type of domestic pigeon derived from the rock pigeon and not like the sort of feral pigeons that many of us are familiar with in our cities. Believe it or not, the earliest documented use of pigeons for communication was with the Romans 2,000 years ago. And their ability to carry important messages has not really diminished in any of that time. So even before Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, the American military had begun ramping up its communication program with the Army Signal Corps. And during the war, carrier pigeons were used in almost every theater by almost every army, both Axis and Allied. About a dozen American pigeon units were activated during the war, and the Army Signal Corps had over 3,000 soldiers and 150 officers assigned to the US military pigeon service. And they cared for more than 54,000 pigeons, and 36,000 of those were deployed overseas. The pigeons were used in all the combat theaters, and they actually saw service with ground troops, on submarines, in bombers, and within the intelligence service. So in an astounding rate of success, Signal Corps soldiers received more than 90% of the Army messages sent by pigeons. So that's a pretty good rate. Pigeons often had to accomplish their missions under really difficult conditions, bad weather, night flying, different home lofts, bullet showers, and even attacks from enemy birds of prey. Thousands of soldiers and airmen and sailors owe their lives to these small animals and the pigeoneers who trained them to deliver their messages when all other means had failed. In 1943, as a means of communication, they formed less than 1% of the Signal Corps' overall services. However, even as the Army moved toward near total mechanization, these birds remained valuable as they were considered an undetectable method of communication. They were used especially when other means of sending messages had failed or were not feasible, such as radio failure or when troops were under orders for radio silence. Pigeons were also an important part of war communications where stringing wire was impossible, like the jungles of Guadalcanal or other Pacific islands. And they were also equally important for paratroopers who frequently had little or no radio communications from their drop zones. So pigeons brought news about the drop zone back to the headquarters swiftly and without revealing the location of the soldiers. And pigeons were actually also dropped via specially made parachutes or inside bamboo boxes or containers. And you can see here an 8-bird pigeon container that would be dropped by parachute. And they had to be put in these containers. Otherwise, as soon as they were let out of the aircraft, they would just fly home. So the soldiers could collect the pigeons, attach the messages, and then send them back with the communication. And the previous slide was the message book and one of the capsules that would be used. And since they were so successful, very few of these messages were encoded. They were so dependable at returning to their home lofts that they didn't worry about the messages getting into enemy hands. And although their talents are really well known. The truth is that we don't know a lot about how pigeons always manage to know how to go home. And we do know that it takes a lot, it really does start with training at a young age. And that there has to be, the loft can actually be moved to new locations and the bird taken hundreds of miles away. And despite the pigeon's new location and sometimes even the loft's new location, the bird will return. So how do they do that? If you go to the next one. Okay, so first, young homing pigeons are purchased or hatched in a loft, and this becomes their permanent home, a place that they'll always return to. They're weaned here and gradually allowed to fly short distances around the loft, and when they return, they get to eat. And so gradually this sort of instills that sort of Pavlovian mechanism that if I do this, I get food. So then they're taken different distances and dropped off, or tossed, as they say, to fly home. They start at half a mile, then a mile, 2, 3, 5, up to and ultimately getting into 250 miles. So once they come home back to that loft easily, then they actually start to move the loft as well as taking the bird different distances. And so they'll start out by releasing several pigeons together so that they can all fly home together. And then taking it down until they're just flying home in pairs. This is also when they'll start to attach the capsule and get the birds used to flying with the message capsule on their leg. And all of this training was actually designed to prevent the bird's association with its home loft in one specific location. This way, the birds could travel with advancing forces or aircraft, stay with them for multiple days if necessary, and then when released, return to their home loft, despite that loft's probable move during the pigeon's time away. So two pigeons who proved themselves during the war. On the left is Yank. And when American soldiers stormed and retook Gafsa, Tunisia, Yank was released with the message of victory. He flew back to headquarters at Tebessa, Algeria, which was 98 miles away, to deliver the news ahead of all other means of communication. Lady Astor is the pigeon on the right, and she also served in North Africa and was sent with an urgent message. She completed a flight of 60 miles, even after she had been shot by pellets, which broke one of her legs and lost a lot of her feathers. She actually collapsed when she returned to her loft, but was nursed back to health. So horses, probably another thing that many of us are familiar with when it comes to military and police work. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Americans on the mainland were on high alert for an enemy attack. And many feared a Japanese invasion on the Pacific coast or a German invasion on the Atlantic coast or Gulf of Mexico. And these fears weren't unfounded. The Japanese did launch over 9,000 balloon bombs, with a few hundred reaching North American shores. And Japanese ships were spotted off the coast of California, and German U-boats interrupted shipping in the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico. And military authorities felt it was really only a matter of time before Axis forces attempted landing operations, even if the landings were not on a grand scale. Small nuisance skirmishes could create a lot of panic and fear in the United States. So ultimately, it became the responsibility of the Coast Guard to protect and defend America's coastline. And German U-boats had sank numerous ships, and the fear of their landing saboteurs on American soil called for this really increased vigilance in spotting them off the coasts. And believe it or not, Hitler did have a plan in place to create a sense of unease and panic in the US. He was really eager to prove to the United States that despite our physical distance from the war in Europe, Americans were still vulnerable. And he, soon after the declaration of war, he ordered a sabotage scheme to begin. It was called Operation Pastorius, and its ultimate goal was to land 1 or 2 small teams of saboteurs in the States every 6 weeks or so to sort of create a network of spies and saboteurs in the US. So the operation started with the launching of 2 submarines in May of 1942, U-202 and U-584. Each carried a 4-man team that was to sneak onto American beaches. They were equipped with 4 waterproof wooden crates containing materials needed to carry out planned bombings and explosions. They were also giving something like $50,000 in American money for living expenses, travel, supply, and bribes specifically too. So the U-584 team landed without incident just south of Jacksonville, Florida. And the saboteurs buried their crates and explosives and walked along Route 1 where they caught a Greyhound bus into Jacksonville. The second team aboard U-202 landed on June 12th on the beach of Agamset, New York. And the men rowed ashore in heavy fog and managed to change their clothes. And they were halfway through burying their crates when one of their team members, George Dash, who you'll see in that picture, spotted a Coast Guardsman on patrol. And this was going to be Seaman Second Class John Cullen. So Dash climbed over a dune to approach Cullen and claimed that he and his friends were stranded. Cullen offered to take him to shelter at a Coast Guard station, and Dash declined. And at this point, Cullen became suspicious. Dash offered him a bribe, and so Cullen, ultimately armed only with a flashlight, took the bribe and walked away. And then as soon as he was enveloped in the fog, he ran back to his Coast Guard station. So this is John Cullen, and he gathered others at the Coast Guard station. They grabbed some weapons and headed back to the beach, but Dash and his team were gone. They had managed to actually catch a train to New York City. And by 10:30 that evening, though, the crates and explosives were located and brought to the Coast Guard commander and the FBI. A manhunt ensued, and eventually all 8 of the saboteurs were captured. So the first attempt of Operation Pistorius failed, but it was a close call for Americans because one team had landed completely undetected. So the need to protect and patrol America's vast coastline was more important than ever. So military authorities that realized that the US Coast Guard would need greater support and better preparation to keep more incidents like this from happening. So no animals were present at the landings, but it made clear that the speed of a horse and or the keener senses of a dog would greatly have enhanced the Coast Guard patrol. So the Coast Guard's need for horses was immediate. There was little time to acquire, train, and allocate the animals. However, the decline of the Army's use of horses resulted in a surplus of trained animals. So therefore, the U.S. Army Remount Branch supplied thousands of horses to the Coast Guard for the use in the beach patrols. And most patrols consisted of 2 men assigned to a 2-mile stretch of beach. The men walked the beach together for their 12-hour shift. And these beach patrols were also tasked with keeping a vigilant eye on the ocean. Often it was the beach patrolmen who were the first people and only people in an area to give assistance when an incident such as a beach fire, a plane crash, or a shipwreck occurred. They became the eyes and ears of the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Army. And horses were ideal for beach patrol. Their speed allowed Coast Guardmen to run down enemies and make prompt reports. It also ensured that more help would be forthcoming when the proper authorities were quickly alerted to the presence of unauthorized persons. And often, since radio communications were not well established between stations, horses provided the fastest way to communicate. And so in one instance, the rescue of 2 people from a Greek ship called the Louise was directly related to the swiftness and alertness of a mounted Coast Guard beach patrol. The Greek steamer broke up in the 5th District near Little Kinnikeet Coast Guard Station, which is off the coast of North Carolina. And a mounted patrol spotted the first of 11 bodies that would wash ashore, but their quick response initiated search and rescue missions and actually saved 2 people from the shipwreck. Similarly, in the 8th District, near the Texas-Louisiana line, in the swamps, Army aviators were rescued when their B-26 bomber crashed. They looked for help and actually ended up getting lost in the swamps. And it was a mounted Coast Guard crew who conducted difficult but thorough search of those swamps and found all of the missing aviators. So by June of 1943, almost 3,000 horses were in use by the U.S. Coast Guard for shore patrol duties, and almost all of these horses had actually come from the U.S. Army. Dogs were also important to shore patrol. Trained dogs could run down and attack unauthorized persons on beaches. And the beach patrol used about 2,000 trained dogs in its operations. And these dogs were also acquired through Dogs for Defense. And I have a few more minutes, so I want to touch on a couple other topics, and then I'm going to take some of your questions. But hard to believe that also bats and spiders made a contribution to the war effort. So bats, there was this idea to use small incendiary bombs attached to bats to firebomb towns and villages. And basically, we wanted to take small bombs, strap them to bats, then let the bats out over enemy territory. And they constructed a special kind of bomb to hold the bats, which is what you can see the picture of there. So that's where you get the idea of a bat bomb. And the idea is that the bats would roost in the eaves of houses, and when the bombs went off, they would already be well in place and spread over a wide area. So there were these small time-delayed bombs, and they had to put the bats in a sort of semi-hibernation state, and then they would gradually warm as they dropped out of the planes. And it sounds crazy, but it actually worked. And it's most well known for burning down a brand new airfield. And they couldn't let the fire crews in because of the secret nature of the program. So it ultimately did not get launched in any kind of full-scale way. It was only in testing. And there's some great books about it. And one of them talks about how they were in a race against the Manhattan Project. That's where they thought that the bomb might be most helpful. And believe it or not, spiders. So how do spiders contribute to a war effort? Well, for a long time, since the 1800s, scientists had been using spider silk in their optical equipment. It was ideal for instruments like scopes and sights because spider silk is so fine that the crossed strands can lie in the same plane, thus allowing for better focus. So the upsurge in production of many military instruments like bomb sights, sniper scopes meant that more silk was needed. So there were people all across the country who would collect silk from spiders and sometimes even splitting that silk into finer threads. And so then they would sell it to the military to be used in the instruments. So what struck me as the most interesting part of this, though, is that, of course, the best silk came from the black widow spider. And soldiers at Fort Knox would be sent out to collect spiders to be sent off to silk farms. And then lastly, one more slide. I have to touch on pets and mascots because they were also a vital part of the war effort for many people. They offered a lot of comfort and a lot of companionship. And so with that, if you'll go one more, shout out to my dog who's downstairs sleeping, and to Felix, which is Lindsay's dog, and our two buddies who helped us to write the book. So, okay, I will take some questions. So Stephen asks, in London, England, there's a beautiful and sizable monument to the annals of the war. Are there similar monuments in the United States? There's nothing quite on that scale in the United States. There are smaller memorials across the country, usually for specific animals or specific units that are doing that. But that's a beautiful memorial. I have been there. What is the most unusual use of an animal in the war that I would discover? I would say probably the bats. I think the spiders to me even kind of make sense because it had been around before, but this idea that bats were gonna do major firebombing, it was really the most surprising thing to me. And then someone asks, what are the main breeds of dogs used? Okay, so believe it or not, initially, any dog of a proper size could be used. And I'll post a chart in the Facebook later and that we made that shows all the breeds that were accepted. Basically anything in the medium to large size range. But it was actually during the war that we discovered that shepherds and other dogs were the most suited for military service. Believe it or not, Doberman Pinschers are not great war dogs. They're actually kind of skittish. And so the Doberman Society had actually gifted a lot of dogs to the Marine Corps, and that's why they're often associated together. But turns out that Dobermans don't make the best war dogs, but a lot of shepherds do. And then Elaine asks, if the handler was killed in action, would his dog go to another, or did the dog have to be retrained on site with another handler? So often the dogs were very loyal to their handlers, and there's stories of the handlers dying and the dogs defending the body. But typically, if a handler was killed, the dog would, it would depend a little bit on the personality of the dog. They might bond with another handler, but typically they would have to go back and have some retraining. Yes. Oh, they're going faster than I can see. Let's see. And do I have a sense of the fatality rate of dogs or pigeons? I don't. The pigeons are really hard, and the dogs to a certain extent. There probably are some numbers, and I can post that in the Facebook too. I don't remember the number off the top of my head. Oh, Brian wants to know, what do the pigeons do on a submarine? Similar to how they would be used, dropped out of aircraft, you could let them go off the coast or in the middle of the ocean, and they would fly back to the home loft with whatever message they needed to send from the submarine. So if that was the location of other subs, the location of ships, which they didn't want to use radios for because they might be giving away their location to an enemy. What about cats? Of course, what about cats? Cats are typically just mascots and pets, which, like I said, is very important. So we certainly do appreciate them. I knew I was going to cut it close on time, and I did have one picture of a cat. I'll post it on Facebook too, so you guys can see it. Let's see. I got some other questions here. Let's see. Oh, and then someone says, wondered if you were aware that the last horse-mounted cavalry charge conducted by the Army took place. Yes, I did. And so that in the Philippines, and the horse chapter in the book is actually sort of split into two. It's split into the use by the Coast Guard and then this last mounted cavalry charge story. And that's a great story about the fighting in the Philippines and how the drawback that they took to get everybody and down into the Bataan Peninsula, only then for most of them to be marched back up. And Lieutenant Ramsey was the leader of that charge, and he actually escaped the Japanese and fought as a guerrilla. And that's a fascinating story. I highly recommend the book Lieutenant Ramsey's War. It's his autobiography, if anybody has a chance. And then what about elephants in Burma? So yeah, I couldn't cover all of them. And then this was mostly talking about the US military's use of animals, but elephants could also be used as pack animals. And in the book, we actually also have a chapter that we called exotics, because I always use the example of, my grandfather who grew up in West Virginia probably hadn't been more than 50 miles away from the house he was born in, and goes to Guadalcanal, and I'm sure he saw a lot of animals that he had never seen before. So a lot of like octopus and elephants and water buffalo and things like that. So there's a whole chapter mostly just of pictures. Would an animal be able to earn a medal? Yes and no. They did initially allow animals to be awarded things like Purple Hearts and all that, but they took them away. They decided, so it's a contentious story. It's also in the book. But there is a medal called the Dickon Medal, which is a British society, the Dickon Society, and they offer medals to animals who have acted in brave ways. And so you can read about them too, the Dickon Medal. Some of the pigeons that I talk about earned the Dickon Medal. Let's see. What did demilitarization training look like for dogs? Well, because part of what the dogs were trained to do was be kind of aggressive. So they had to get out of that sort of aggressive mode. And that was really the only thing that could keep you from sort of graduating to go home, was if you continued to stay too aggressive. And I think there's only a case of that happening once or twice of all the dogs that were demilitarized. But like people, combat is difficult. There were definitely dogs that suffered from stress from the battle conditions that they had. So they needed time to sort of feel safe and to be back in a totally different environment, in a home environment versus a battle environment. Lieutenant Putney also wrote a great book, and he talks a lot about the demilitarization training of the dogs in his book. Let's see. And about dogs and animals getting ranks. And yes, they did get a rank, and the rank was always one above their handler. So if a handler got promoted, the dog got promoted one up. Sort of that typical military style of you're always, that rank matters. And so if your dog outranks you, then you owe it a level of respect. Let's see. Any laboratory retrievers used? Yes, I'm sure. I can't think of a story off the top of my head, but they were definitely one of the breeds that was used during the war. And somebody asked, did they use dolphins? I looked that up when we were researching the book, and it was kind of unclear. It seems like dolphins have been used by the military since then for different things, but it wasn't really clear to me if we were doing any of that training during World War II. And we didn't have any pictures of it, and we didn't have any stories of it, so we sort of left it out of the book overall. Let's see. Okay. Oh, yeah. And then Wojciech the bear, used by the Polish. Yes, again, American animals for this book. So we couldn't cover the bear. And we did talk about it in the larger exhibition that we had the year before the book came out, because we also talked about the Germans' use of horses, because the Germans actually used more horses than anybody during the war. Okay. And does the military still use dogs? Yes, actually, very much so. And were Newfoundlands used? Probably. They were one of the breeds also that was acceptable. And okay, I think that's pretty much all of the questions. Unless I see any others. Looks good. Okay, well, thank you all very much, and I really appreciate you taking time to listen to me talk about loyal forces. If you have questions later, feel free to put them on the Facebook thing, and I'll post some other pictures and information in there as well.